Chapter 5. Jack accepts food from a creepy old lady. Hiccup Horrendous Haddock left Jack with a water urn and the question of whether or not he wanted to eat dinner with the rest of the village. Jack had told him that he needed to look after Jamie until he woke up, so Hiccup proposed that he could stop by sometime before dinner and ask again, in case Jamie had woken up by then. Jack agreed, and Hiccup climbed onto Toothless the dragon, who jumped off the balcony and descended into the village below. Jack remained standing at the edge of the balcony for a minute or two, or 5 or 10, until his arms started aching from holding the water urn, and a gentle tweeting made him turn around. Baby Tooth was looking at him, her eyes wide with worry and pity. Jack sent her a half smile, then walked past her, back into the hut again. The wind was chilly, and his bare feet were ice cold. It was impossible not to notice, even if Jack tried very hard not to. Baby Tooth followed him inside, and he closed the door, setting the water urn down on the floor. Jamie was still sleeping, and didn't seem like he would be waking up any time soon. Jack felt his legs go up beneath him, and he slid against the wall down to the floor, bringing his knees up to his chest. Hiccup Horrendous Haddock and Toothless the dragon, whose lack of teeth was strange, but at least it explained the name, had been a brilliant distraction. He still couldn't quite believe it. First he tripped over his own feet at the sight of those terrifying beasts, and only a short hour later or less, he was letting one of them press his giant snout against his hand. Hiccup had been a nice distraction too, with his kind words and strange name, and his presence pushed Jack to forget how incredibly overwhelmed he was, or at least shove it to the back of his mind. It was all very welcome. Jack hated dwelling on his feelings. But now he was alone, save for Baby Tooth and the unconscious Jamie. However, Jack had already shown his less happy, less carefree, less Jack Frost side of him to Baby Tooth before. She couldn't stop the thoughts inside Jack's head from climbing to the surface. Anyway, it seemed there wasn't any Jack Frost left, only Jackson Overland, who Jack had thought was gone forever. And yet he was right here, staring back at him in the reflection of a rusty knife, in this old hut, in this strange dragon village, where people spoke a language Jack had never heard before and wore clothes like they were living in the past. Jack let out a shaky breath, burrowing his head in his arms. "Is this the past, Baby Tooth?" he murmured. "Is that what the time fragment did to us?" She didn't need to answer, because he already knew the truth. Maybe they'd been flung into some kind of alternative dimension as well, where dragons did exist, or they were just so far back in the past, even before Jack's time as human, he wouldn't have known whether or not some corners of the earth had been inhabited by dragons at some point. But that was crazy, right? He didn't know. It wasn't like he had ever taken history class. He was so confused. Baby Tooth chirped softly, and Jack felt her put her tiny hand onto his own. Jack lifted his head to look back at her. "But why am I like this?" he asked her. "That's the part I really don't understand." Baby Tooth averted her eyes and shook her head. She didn't know. Jack sighed and looked down at his hands. He turned them over, flexing his fingers before running them through his brown hair. Dread was building in his gut. Because if he didn't have his powers, how would he get them back? He hadn't been Jackson Overland in 300 years. Did he even know how to be a human anymore? Especially in a place that had fully fledged, real-life dragons roaming the sky. And the most important question, how would he be able to protect Jamie? Was he even a guardian anymore? Baby Tooth chirped gently, flying over to the water urn. Jack looked at her and chuckled half-heartedly. "Thanks, Baby Tooth," he whispered, picking up the water urn again. He brought it to his lips, taking a tentative sip, and then another one, and another two, until he was chugging. When it was all but empty, he put the urn down, frowning at it. Had water ever tasted this good? Jack couldn't remember. He couldn't even remember what being thirsty felt like, but he supposed this was it. There was a thud outside again, making Jack jolt back onto his feet. He almost knocked the water urn over, but grabbed it up and carried it out of the way. The door opened a few seconds later, and in came a short, hunchbacked old lady, wearing a brown leather tunic and a horned helmet. Her hair was long and grey, tied into a couple of braids, and she was holding a wooden staff with bones tied to it. This had to be the village elder Hiccup had mentioned, Gothi. He had never seen anyone as befitting the title as village elder than this woman. Even if he knew it would happen, Jack still felt a jolt of surprise when her eyes locked with his. Hello, Jack greeted tentatively. He really hoped this truly was Gothi, or else he thought he might be in danger. Did he feel threatened by an old lady half his height? Yes, he did. Gothi didn't reply, but even if she had, Jack wouldn't have caught what she said because he got distracted. Just then he spotted what he assumed was a dragon, along with 3 other creatures he also just had to assume were dragons, even if none of them struck him as such. The biggest one was round, with a huge head but small wings and large pointy teeth. The others were tiny, at least by dragon standards, about the size of a large house cat. 2 of them were green and 1 was red, and they were flocking around the big dragon like excited puppies. The big dragon seemed to be eating rocks. Gothi closed the door, and Jack's attention was forced back to her. She sent him a long look, eyes going up and down his body, before they went over to Jamie. She brought a hand to her chin, scratching it thoughtfully, before she wobbled over to the part of the room Jack had dubbed the witch corner. Maybe that was disrespectful to a village healer. Hopefully she couldn't read minds. Jack shifted his weight, sending Babytooth a look. She just shrugged in reply, looking as bewildered as Jack felt. "You're Gothi, right?" Jack asked, stumbling slightly over the name. Gothi turned around and nodded before she turned back to the table. She opened a pot and poured some kind of liquid into a bowl. Jack tasted North's medicine at the sight of it. "I was told you've been taking care of us," he continued, walking closer to Jamie. Gothi stopped moving. She sent Jack a narrow look. Jack swallowed. "What?" Gothi glanced at the door before she sighed and shook her head. She continued pouring the pot's content into the bowl, then picked it up and walked over to Jack. She held the bowl out to him. Jack wasn't sure if he wanted to accept it. "Am I supposed to drink that?" he asked. Gothi nodded. Jack was about to carefully decline, but the look Gothi sent him made it clear that he didn't have a choice in the matter. Arguing with North had been one thing. At least Jack had had a small hope that he might be able to talk himself out of being spoon-fed, even if he did end up losing the argument. But this old lady was quiet and slightly menacing in her own way. Jack cleared his throat and took the bowl. "Thanks," he mumbled, looking down at the brownish soup. He didn't know what it was. Gothi smiled ever so slightly and then motioned for Jack to sit down with her staff. Jack tentatively did as she said, and Gothi walked away. Jack could hear her walking across the room, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Outside, the dragons were squawking and growling, but if Gothi didn't react, Jack supposed it was normal. "You're not much of a talker," Jack said. Gothi didn't reply. Jack tapped his fingers against the bowl before he steeled himself and took a sip, and gagged. North's medicine had nothing on this. Jack almost yearned for it, if it meant he didn't have to drink this. At least North had tried to remedy his miraculous cure with some sugar. This was like eating mud. No, Jack had face-planted enough times to know that this was even worse than mud. Babytooth tweeted at him, flying in front of his face as he grimaced. "It's horrible," he whispered to her in English. Babytooth smiled sympathetically. Then Gothi was coming back, and Jack looked up, desperate for a reason not to eat any more of the soup. His heart skipped a beat. "My staff!" he gasped. He set the bowl down to get to his feet. Gothi smiled that little smile of hers and held the staff out to him. Jack reached out to take it, but hesitated. In Gothi's hand, the staff just looked like a regular wooden stick. No frost and no magical properties. Normally, frost would appear on the staff the minute Jack touched it, and he would be able to fly, but things weren't normal, and Jack wasn't sure if he was ready to face that truth. If he took the staff in his hands and it did nothing... Gothi was giving him an inquisitive look. Faintly, he wondered why she had kept the staff in a separate room, but he knew he wouldn't get an answer if he asked. He pressed his lips together and grabbed the staff. Nothing happened. Jack had trouble finding his voice for a few seconds. He glanced at Gothi and nodded. "Thank you," he said, gripping the staff with his other hand as well. There was no frost, no feeling of weightlessness. There was nothing. Gothi nodded, heading back to the front door. The dragons exited first, but before Gothi followed, she turned around and gestured to the bowl on the floor, sending Jack a stern look. Then, still without a word, she walked out and closed the door. Jack sank back onto the fur skin, holding his staff close to his chest. He let out a long, shaky breath, his eyes sliding shut. "That settles it, I guess," Jack mumbled, rubbing his face. He could feel a headache rapidly coming his way, as well as another sensation in his stomach. Hunger, he realized. It had been a while. Jack sighed, looking up at Baby Tooth. He sent her a tired, joyless smile. "I'm officially human again." Hiccup tried his best to hide that his mind was elsewhere, while he and the others were out training with their dragons. He was doing a pretty good job, up until the point where Snotlout did something that apparently was reckless and very snot-loudy, but Hiccup hadn't been paying attention to see what it was. And Hiccup's response had been, "Very good, Snotlout, you've improved so much," earning disbelieving looks from all of them, including Snotlout. "What? Yeah, did you hear that?" Snotlout then boasted, crossing his arms from where he sat atop a disgruntled hookfang. "That was all part of the plan." "Almost crashing into that rock was part of the plan?" Fishlegs asked dryly. "Shut up, Fishlegs. You wouldn't understand." Astro was sending Hiccup a long look, and Hiccup pressed his lips nervously together. "Maybe reduce the almost crashing into rocks part, yeah," he added. He looked up to the sky to see where the sun was. "Oh, look, it's almost time for dinner. I should head back. There's something I have to do before—" "Hold on," Astrid interrupted, and Hiccup already knew he'd been busted when he met her eyes. "What's going on with you today? You've been acting weird ever since we got here." Hiccup wasn't a very good liar, especially not in front of Astrid. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, averting his eyes. Astrid crossed her arms. "Why do you have to leave early?" she challenged. Hiccup started, but trailed off when he realized that even if he'd come up with a decent lie, he wouldn't have been able to deliver it anyway. The others were staring expectantly at him too now, and he sighed. "I visited Gothi earlier, and one of them was awake. The older one. I said I'd stop by before dinner in case he felt well enough to join us." "You talked to him?" Ruffnut asked, her eyes going wide. "What did he say?" Tuffnut asked, wearing a copy of her sister's expression. "What was he like?" followed Fishlegs. "Why didn't you say anything?" Snotlout demanded. "Because the guy just woke up from surviving a blizzard," Hiccup replied, irritated. "Do you think I'm going to let you bombard him with your questions when he's already tired enough as it is?" Tuffnut huffed. "Harsh," he muttered. Hiccup ignored him. "How is he?" Astrid asked, losing the annoyed tilt to her brows. Hiccup thought back to the meeting, frowning. "Better than I thought he would be," he replied. "He looked exhausted and all, but he didn't look like he had a fever or anything. He was actually pretty chipper, considering. For the most part, anyway," he added inwardly. Astrid hummed thoughtfully. "That's very strange," she said. "Yeah, everything about him is strange," Hiccup muttered. Then he shook his head. "Well, I'm going to fly over there and check with him. And no, you're not coming with me." The protest came immediately, but Hiccup just shook his head. "You'll see him eventually anyway," he said. "Right now he probably needs to be alone to recover. Bringing the whole party might scare him." Hiccup had trouble believing that after he saw how Jack had reacted to Toothless. Shocked, but not exactly afraid. A few annoying Vikings were probably no problem, but even so, Hiccup knew he wouldn't appreciate their company if he were in Jack's shoes. Or lack thereof. He should get himself some shoes. "Scare him," Snotlout repeated with a snort, rolling his eyes. He flexed. "Well, I guess I do seem imposing. I just can't help it." "And that's my cue to leave," Hiccup said. "I'll see you guys at dinner." He didn't give them any more time to argue before Toothless took off, and they set course back to the village. Before coming to Gothi's hut, however, he made a small stop at home and fetched a pair of his old boots, thrown away in a chest in his room. Sure, they were worn, but at least the quality was good, and one of the few shoes he had left that were a pair. And it was definitely better than walking around barefoot. He only hoped they wouldn't be too small. Not much of a welcome gift, really, but it would have to do. Hiccup noted the half-eaten pile of rocks on Gothi's balcony when he landed, along with some dried spots of lava. Gothi must have been home at one point, but right now she was probably in the Great Hall with everyone else. She really should be careful with that Gronkle drool, though, unless she wanted to burn her house down. Hiccup shook his head and jumped off Toothless, patting his head as he walked by. His hand was inches from the door when he heard the distinct sound of wings flapping behind him. He turned around, giving the whole Dragon Rider gang a dirty look. "What did I tell you?" Snotlout gave a laugh. "Who put you in charge?" he asked back, making the twins snicker. Hiccup ignored him and sent Astrid an exasperated look instead. "You too?" he asked. Astrid shrugged. "They were going anyway," she said. "Who was I to stop them?" "Astrid!" "I was there when we found them. I wanted to make sure they're all right too," Astrid argued. "It's only polite to introduce ourselves to our guests," Fishlegs tried, but shut up once Hiccup sent him a glower. "And we want to settle whether or not he's some kind of fae," Roughnut said. "Or troll," Toughnut added. "Troll?" Hiccup repeated incredulously. "That's crazy even for you two. How'd you even get that idea?" "And we all know you're the one who went looking for trolls when you were younger," Toughnut shot back, holding a finger up importantly. "And you never found one, so who knows what they look like." "Trolls don't wear shoes, Hiccup," Roughnut said, matter-of-factly. Hiccup stared at them. "Trolls aren't real, and Jack is definitely not." "Trolls aren't real?" Hiccup spun around and almost tripped over his own legs. The door was open and Jack was leaning against its frame, an amused look on his tired face. In his right hand, he was holding the staff Hiccup had found him with. He didn't look much better than he had before, aside from the slightest of color in his cheeks. Gothi must have served him an infamous soup. "Jack," Hiccup said. Warmth was creeping up his neck, and he had to use all his willpower not to turn around and glower at the others. No, they aren't. How much of that did you hear?" Jack smiled. "The walls aren't exactly soundproof," he replied, his eyes going up to the others. He huffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You all ride dragons?" he asked. The Dragon Riders exchanged glances before they all broke into different variations of boisterous poses, save for Astrid, who was watching Jack curiously. "All right, well, since you're all here already, and even if I specifically told you not to come," Hiccup said, and glanced at Jack, gesturing at the others. "These are Berg's first Dragon Riders and also my friends. Snotlout, Roughnut and Toughnut, Fishlegs, and Astrid." Jack made a face like he was impressed. "Interesting names," he commented, and Hiccup blinked. Seeing how timid Jack had been during their first proper meeting, the vaguely rude comment took him by surprise. Not that anyone on Berg were ashamed of their rather ugly names. It was set to fight off gnomes and trolls, after all. Clearly, that didn't work if Jack was one. "And the dragons?" Jack asked. "Do they have names?" "Of course," Snotlout said, patting his dragon proudly. "This is Hookfang. He's a monstrous nightmare, as you can see. And just as his rider, he's the strongest, fastest, most fearsome." "This is Stormfly," Astrid interrupted, sending Jack a smile. "Don't worry about Snotlout, he's just like that." "Hey." "And this is Meatluck," Fishluck said, as Meatluck flew closer and dropped onto the balcony, wobbling over to the rocks Gothi's dragon had left behind. "She's a Gronkle, but don't let that scare you. She's the sweetest dragon you'll ever meet." Roughnut made a retching sound after that. "And this is Belge," Toughnut said, then gestured to the dragon's second head. "And this is Barf," Roughnut said, crossing her arms proudly. "The heads have different names, even if they're the same dragon?" Jack asked. "Well, they don't share the same brain," Toughnut said. "Unlike the twins," Hiccup mumbled under his breath, quiet enough so the others wouldn't hear. Jack heard, however, and visibly held back a laugh, a grin crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Are you going to tell us your name?" Astrid asked. Jack sent Hiccup a curious look. "Not a gossiper, I see," he commented. I would have been telling everyone about the weird barefooted guy if I were you. He smiled at him, before turning back to the others. My name is Jackson Overland, but like I told Hiccup earlier, you can call me Jack. Toughnut snorted. And he says our names are weird, he said, making Roughnut snicker. Jack raised a brow, but didn't retort. Don't mind them either, Hiccup mumbled awkwardly, scratching his cheek. I don't, Jack replied with a chuckle, before taking a step out onto the balcony, closing the door behind himself. I've never had such a grand welcome committee before. Maybe except... He cut himself off, shaking his head. No, on second thought, dragons are cooler than North's, helpers. Hiccup had no idea what he was talking about, but he was glad Jack was enough at ease to talk. Who's North? Snotlot asked, narrowing his eyes. And what do you mean by helpers? Oh, so technically this isn't a welcome committee? Fishlegs said. Is it true you were dropped in the forest as an offering to the forest spirits? Toughnut asked. If so, who dropped you there? Hiccup face-palmed. Oh, for Thor's sake, I knew this would happen. Jack looked confused, but at least he didn't look offended. He tilted his head to the side. Forest spirits? He repeated, then looked at Hiccup. Did you just say Thor? Hiccup was about to answer, but then a horn sounded below them, and the dragon stirred. Jack did as well, alarm alight on his face. It's dinner time, Hiccup quickly said with a small chuckle. Nothing to worry about. Raise you on the way down, Snotlout yelled, already turning Hookfang around. Hey, no fair, Roughnut yelled back, she and Toughnut quick to follow. And in the blink of an eye, the dragon riders had disappeared, because dinner was apparently more exciting than the guest who might be a troll or an offer to the forest spirits. Most of them anyway. Astrid remained. Stormfrey landed on the balcony and Astrid hopped off. They can be a bit much sometimes, she told Jack. Really? Jack asked with a grin. Which one of them came up with the troll theory? Hiccup held back a groan. Sorry about that, he muttered, rubbing his forehead. You're probably still tired. I told them not to come. Jack shrugged. They seem fun, he just said with a lopsided smile, though it faltered a second later. Jamie hasn't woken up yet. I can't risk him waking up without me. Thanks for the offer, though. I'm sure your dinner is better than the soup Gothi gave me. Both Hiccup and Astrid cringed. Sorry you had to go through that, Astrid said with a laugh. Still, it's not the worst Gothi could have cooked up to heal you. You're lucky. There was a hint of worry in Jack's expression. She's an interesting old lady, he said, and sounded only half sarcastic. Do I want to know? Oh, there's many stories, Hiccup said, shaking his head. But I don't think you'll have to worry about that if, what was his name again? If your brother's in as good shape as you are, you'll be out of here in no time. For a moment, Jack only looked at him without talking. Oh, all right, he then said, shifting his weight. Hiccup felt like he'd taken a wrong turn. I mean, you probably didn't plan on staying here, he said, and got a warning look from Astrid. Was he making it worse? Right? He added weakly. Not really, no, Jack replied, twirling his staff in his hand. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but seemed to change his mind. He frowned. I don't really know how things work around here, but we're really far from home. I didn't plan on staying here, but I have a feeling I won't have much of a choice. The last part came out in a slightly dejected mumble. Astrid's hand twitched as if she wanted to reach out to him, but she stopped herself. Why did you come here in the first place? She asked. Hiccup gave her an uncertain look, but Astrid replied with a determined one of her own. She looked back at Jack. I don't mean to pry, but things have been tense lately. People are paranoid. And the way we found you wasn't exactly normal. So you helped us as well? Jack asked. Astrid narrowed her eyes a fraction. It was Hiccup and I, she said, but that doesn't answer my question. Jack looked back at her, the last remnant of his smile fading away. He was quiet for a few seconds before he shook his head. I don't remember, he replied. Hiccup and Astrid stared at him. Nothing? Hiccup asked. Jack shook his head. Nope, he said, switching his hold on his staff to his other hand. One moment I was out in the woods with Jamie, and the next thing I know, He gestured at Toothless and Stormfly, who both stirred at having Jack's attention. Dragons. Hiccup frowned. Jack sounded genuine, but he'd met his fair share of liars. He couldn't just take his word for it. Memory loss was the easiest lie to tell, too. Was he hiding something from them? He glanced at Astrid and could tell that the same thoughts were running through her head. Evidently, it seemed Jack could tell as well, because his gaze became guarded and his stance tense. I understand if you don't trust me, he started, but seemed to struggle with his words. And I don't really have any way of proving that I'm not up to no good. But I need... He cut himself off and looked down at the floorboards. I need to keep Jamie safe. He's all that I have, and I'm all that he has right now. Hiccup and Astrid were both paranoid. After everything that happened with Johann, and with the two boys' inexplicable appearance, trust didn't come easy. At the same time, there was something about Jack that thought that mistrust. Hiccup couldn't tell what it was, because Jack did have a sort of fox-like quality, somewhat reminiscent of the twins, that should have had the opposite effect of what he was feeling. Maybe because there was a boyish mischievousness rather than a malicious one. Or maybe it was just the transparency of his love for his younger brother, which shined through everything about him. Body and words as clear as day. Hiccup felt inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt, despite everything. You'll have to talk to my father, Hiccup said. Astrid cut him a glance. Obviously she wasn't as charmed as Hiccup. Jack frowned. Your father? He repeated. Oh, right. Hiccup hadn't told him about that yet. The chief, Hiccup said, awkwardly shifting his weight. He's called Stoke the Vast, and I don't envy that talk, but I really doubt you'll find any way around it. You're the chief's son? Jack asked, a smile making its way onto his face again. It was still lopsided, and Hiccup thought to himself that if Jack wanted to prove to them that he wasn't up to no good, he should really lose that smile. Why didn't you say so earlier, Your Highness? He bowed. Astrid snorted then, and Hiccup felt heat crawl up his neck. At least Jack hadn't been intimidated, which was why Hiccup had left out his information in the first place. But this wasn't much better. Because of reactions like that, he replied dryly, and Jack laughed. Sorry, he said unapologetically. He cleared his throat. Well, that's fine, I guess, as long as he doesn't throw me in a dungeon or anything. He paused, sending them both a look. He won't throw me in a dungeon, right? It was Hiccup's and Astrid's turn to laugh. Probably not, Astrid said, as long as you act at least somewhat decent. Hiccup smiled fondly at her. Asper kids don't have very high standards, so I wouldn't worry about that, he added. Oh, good, Jack said. I've heard I'm a menace. You'll fit right in then, Hiccup said. Then he remembered something. Oh, I have something for you, he said, and turned to Toothless. He walked around him and reached for the boots he had left dangling from the saddle. He held them out to Jack. You might have survived a blizzard, but if you keep going around barefoot, you'll catch a cold eventually. Jack's brows furrowed, his eyes flickering between Hiccup and the boots. I don't... He started, but cut himself off again. He sighed. All right, I guess that's necessary. Astrid looked bewildered. Hiccup wanted to say, I told you he was weird, but saved it for later. Nice boots, though, Jack added, accepting the boots from Hiccup. For whatever reason, he didn't seem overly enthusiastic about the prospect of wearing shoes, but before Hiccup could ask, if he even dared, Jack suddenly looked up. Thank you, he quickly said. It's very kind of you. They're just my old boots, Hiccup said, scratching his cheek. Why are you barefoot, anyway? Astrid asked, always more courageous than Hiccup. Jack shrugged. They're in the way, he said. Hiccup decided that there were just some things about this guy that he'd never understand. The notion was emphasized when Jack suddenly blinked, his gaze going distant, before he turned around and carefully opened the door. He peeked inside, letting out a relieved breath. He turned back to Hiccup and Astrid. Jamie's waking up, he said quietly. I'll catch up with you later. Talk to your dad and all that, yeah? He was already inside the hut again, obviously in a hurry. Hiccup just nodded. Yes, right, he said, trying to catch a glimpse of the kid, but Jack was blocking his view. Good luck? Jack's smile was slightly strained. Thanks, he muttered. "Come on, Hiccup," Astrid said, and started dragging him back to the dragons. "See you, Jack." Jack nodded at them before closing the door. Hiccup and Astrid climbed back onto the dragons, but before jumping off the balcony to join the others, they both shared a look, knowing what the other was thinking. "Did you see that?" Astrid asked. "How did you know he was waking up?" Hiccup shook his head. "I'm beginning to think asking questions will just lead to more questions with that guy," he muttered. Jamie's head felt like it was filled with cotton. His entire body felt heavy, and it ached when he tried to move, especially the side of his head. His eyelids were hard to open. He faintly heard a door opening and closing, and then the slightest sound of footsteps coming towards him. Whoever it was light and swift, and Jamie wondered for a moment if Sophie had snuck into his room again. His mom would berate her if she did. She didn't want Sophie to catch Jamie's cold as well. "Jamie, it's okay." That wasn't Sophie. Jamie frowned, shifting in his bed. His eyelids were so heavy, but when he felt a hand on his shoulder, he forced himself to open them. The room he was in was dark. The only light source, judging by how it was flickering, had to come from a candle or a fire, but it was far from enough. Jamie could barely see anything. Fire? The gears in Jamie's head turned as his memories started coming back to him. This reminded him of something. It was almost the same as when they'd woken up in Santa's workshop. Was he still back there? And that voice. He struggled to focus on the figure beside him, expecting to see the white hair of Jack. He didn't, and Jamie jerked away in alarm. It took him a moment to find his voice. Who are you?" he asked. He was surprised by the sound of his own voice. It was so hoarse and weak, he almost didn't recognize himself. The boy, who still looked kind of blurry to Jamie, was quiet for a couple of seconds. Jamie blinked, trying to clear the image of him. Brown eyes came into view, along with a pair of brown eyebrows, thin lips, and faint freckles. There were heavy bags under his eyes. The boy smiled faintly. "It's okay," he said, holding his palms up. Jamie felt a small jolt in his chest. That voice didn't belong to him. "I know it must seem scary, but you're okay, Jamie. It's me, Jack. Jack Frost." "Jack Frost?" Jamie stared at him. "You don't look like Jack Frost," he told him. The boy who claimed to be Jack Frost pressed his lips together, his shoulders sinking. "I know," he said, "but whatever he was going to say never came out because he got distracted by something small and colorful appearing in front of his face." Jamie blinked. "But Babytooth?" he croaked. Babytooth nodded vigorously, happily chirping at him. She flickered in front of his face, and though Jamie couldn't understand anything she was saying, he got the general idea that she had been worried. Even if all he heard was tweeting, she sounded like a frantic mother. But if Babytooth was here... Jamie looked back at the boy, whose face had softened as he looked at Babytooth. He could see her, and Babytooth seemed okay around him. And now that Jamie could see a bit better in the dim lighting, his face really was a mirror image of Jack's. Even his freckles were all in the right place. "What's going on?" Jamie asked tentatively. Jack, if it really was him, averted his eyes, his smile fading. "I don't really know," he admitted. His brows furrowed, and once again, Jamie could see how much he looked like Jack. Was it really him? "What happened to you?" he asked. "I don't know. Where are we? I don't know. Well..." The boy looked around the hut, letting out a small huff of air. "This hut belongs to an old lady called Gothi. She's been helping us recover. And we're currently in a place called Burke." "Burke," Jamie repeated. It sounded completely unfamiliar. He looked down at his hands, and then finally noticed what he'd been sleeping on. Not on a bed, but some kind of fur. Judging by the smell, it was real. Beside him was a hearth, its flames crackling softly. And all of a sudden, Jamie remembered. He brought a hand to his head. His heart was speeding up, and pressure was forming in his chest. He wanted to look to Jack for support, because he always seemed to know what to do, but he wasn't even sure if the boy sitting beside him was Jack. Babytooth tweeted softly, landing in front of him to put a hand on Jamie's. "I have this." Jamie looked up to see that the boy was holding out a piece of paper to him. It took a moment before Jamie recognized it, and he carefully accepted it. "Found it in my pocket. I never did get the chance to hang it in North's workshop, but Now I'm kinda happy I didn't. The boy chuckled softly as Jamie unfolded the paper. It was his own drawing, Jack's Christmas present. There were a few seconds of silence. Jamie looked up, struggling to find his voice. You're really him? He asked, even if he thought he already believed it. Jack smiled faintly and nodded, though the smile lacked any actual happiness. There's a lot I need to tell you, Jamie, he said carefully, of where we are and what I think happened. The thing, Jamie started. I fell from the sleigh. You caught me. I remember that. Yes, but Jack seemed to struggle with his words. I wasn't strong enough to change our course. The fragment pulled us in and transported us here, I guess. We were found in the middle of a blizzard, of all things. Jack shook his head. Not that I remember that. I just remember the snow, and then I was here, looking like this. He gestured to himself, clearly not happy with that fact. It took a few seconds before Jamie registered what that implied. They can see you? He asked in awe. Jack became very quiet, as opposed to the happiness Jamie had expected. Why wouldn't Jack be happy to be seen? Jack traced his hand over his staff, which was lying on the floor beside him. I don't have my powers, Jamie, he said. Jamie stared at him. Why not? Jack pursed his lips and shrugged. Don't know, he said. But I'm not invisible, so that's good, I guess. The thing is, I'm not invisible because I'm not, I'm... He let out a shaky breath, like a laugh that never quite made it out. I'm human. Jamie frowned. That was not good news, was it? This sounded like bad news. Judging by Jack's dejected expression, it was definitely bad news. But surely he knew what to do, right? He always did. So, Jamie started, what now? Jack opened his mouth to answer, but just then there was a sound coming from outside that made Jamie jolt up into a sitting position, heart thumping in his chest. What was that? He whispered. Oh, that's... Jack laughed, and even if the sound, the shriek, the screech, the roar, had been terrifying, if Jack could laugh about it, it probably wasn't so bad. He sent Jamie a smile and offered him a hand. Feel well enough to stand? I think you're gonna like this. Jamie glanced at Babytooth, but she just smiled secretively. So he took Jack's hand and shakily got to his feet. What is it? Jamie asked as they walked towards the door. There's a lot of strange things about this place, but it all gets outshined by the, Jack weighed his words before opening the door. Pets? They walked out onto a wooden balcony without any railing. The wind was in Jamie's hair immediately, and he could tell that they were far above the ground. In front of them was a beautiful view of the ocean. The sun had just disappeared behind the horizon, and the moon and the stars reflected in the water, brighter than any night sky Jamie had ever seen. What really caught Jamie's attention, however, were the flying silhouettes in the sky. He felt his face go slack. When he spoke, his voice barely made it out. Dragons? Jack crouched beside him, following the dragons with his eyes. Dragons, he confirmed. But, Jamie started and found himself pinching his own arm, but, like with Santa's workshop, this wasn't a dream either. Dragons aren't. The word real halted on his tongue. He wasn't the type to throw that word around lightly. Jack hummed. Seems pretty real to me, he replied. Jamie stared at him, then felt a grin spread on his face. He leaned on Jack's shoulder as he sat down, turning his gaze back to the dragons in the sky. You never told me there were dragons, he said. That's because I didn't know, Jack said, amused. Trust me, I was as shocked as you were when I first saw them, if not more. I even tripped over my own feet. Jamie snorted, but it made him wonder. Why didn't you know? He asked, looking back at him. There was a kind of glint in Jack's eyes that revealed before he even said anything that he was about to say something in that jokingly haughty way he sometimes did. It made Jamie all the more certain that this really was Jack. He cleared his throat. I know I come off as this wise, all-knowing type of person, he started, smiling at Jamie when he laughed. Jack then broke his character, letting out a small exhale as he looked back up at the sky. But I've never seen a dragon, nor have I heard they ever existed. If so, it was before my time. Before Jack's time? Jamie didn't even know for sure how far back that meant, but it didn't matter. Jack had made him realize something. something that made his stomach tighten and his head spin a little. He looked over the edge of the balcony. The village below them was nothing like Jamie had ever seen before. It was hard to see in the darkness, and the only light came from what looked like torches, not street lamps or anything like that. Most of the buildings seemed to be made out of wood, with some exceptions like the huge stone staircase and statues of what looked like horned people. And everything was huddled together in a way that looked kind of haphazard and chaotic. Still, it was pretty in its own way. The houses had tall, curved roofs, and some were painted in bright colors. It all made the village look old, like pictures had seen in his history book. Jamie bit the inside of his cheek, sitting back. He looked up at Jack. "We went back in time," he said, and it wasn't a question. Jack was quiet for a few seconds before he nodded. "It seems we did," he confirmed. He turned to look at Jamie with a questioning expression. "Are you scared?" he asked gently. "Yes." Jamie pressed his lips together, then shrugged. "Should I be scared?" he asked back, dodging the question. And to his relief, Jack smiled. "No," he said, leaning back on his arms to look up at the sky again. Jamie could see where his eyes lingered. The moon. "After battling and defeating the Nightmare King, I'd say we've been through worse." Babytooth, who'd settled on Jack's shoulder again, chirped in agreement. Jamie nodded, following his gaze. "I did ask for an adventure," he mumbled, mostly to himself. Between the aching in his body and Jack losing his powers, it wasn't quite what he'd imagined, but it would be fine, wouldn't it? He felt Jack's eyes on him and looked up to meet them. It was strange to see him with brown hair and brown eyes. Not bad, but it was something he'd have to get used to. "I'll get us home, Jamie," Jack said seriously, placing a hand on Jamie's shoulder and squeezing gently. "Powers or not, we'll find a way. I promise." And Jamie believed him.